so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Harry will tell me if you can't hear me, so I'm going to kind of stick close to the microphone if I can. I really wanted to come to this talk. There was a snowstorm, and so I did leave the day early. But I really wanted to hear from an interdisciplinary group of African studies scholars. And also for me, Libya is not a place where I've been able to do field work. And so I feel like a bit of an imposter talking to you about Libya, as opposed to places I've actually been able to do work in. So I'm looking forward to the question and answer very, very much. And I look forward to sort of rethinking some of the things that we may have found in light of your questions and comments. But without further ado, I'm going to talk to you today about energy, water, and infrastructural decay in Libya, which is part of a project that my colleague Erica of Duke University and I have been working on for some time now. The project is called the Targeting of Infrastructure in the Middle East, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it before I talk about the specific case of Libya. So we started our project by thinking that when we looked at what was happening in the post-2011 world of the Middle East, we saw a lot of targeting of civilian infrastructure, right, with impunity, right, seeming without accountability. And so one of our first questions was, how does the targeting of civilian infrastructure impact human security in ways that are not necessarily evident right away? So we are interested in the kind of long-term, cumulative, and interactive effects, which are actually quite hard to document, even as they're extremely obvious. So the other question we wanted to ask is, why do parties to conflict do these types of targeting? What types of targeting do we see out there in the world? And can they be held accountable? And I think in the question and answer, we're going to get to more of that question of accountability. And then lastly, we were interested in what we see as a gap in international law between international humanitarian law, which deals with essentially crimes against civilian objects, and environmental law, criminal environmental law, which essentially is crimes against nature. And the topic that I'm going to talk about today, this notion of environmental infrastructures, kind of falls in between and thus gets left out of international legal regimes. So to just do a little bit on our actual data collection and methods, we basically put together a database that tracks discrete incidents of targeting. And by discrete, we mean things that were counted as sort of a one-off in a news source or another data set. And we basically decided to track water, energy, health, agricultural, and transportation. And there's some variation between the cases, the way that we do that I won't go into right now. So for the sources that we use, the UN agencies, particularly Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, is particularly helpful for many of our cases, because as you know, they release weekly to monthly updates on things like the targeting of civilian infrastructures for these conflicts. We also use the Armed Conflict and Location Database, ACLED, which many of you in political science are familiar with. We use specific databases for specific conflicts when they were available. And this is the example of the Civilian Impact Monitoring Project for Yemen, which got started after our work started, but we were able to incorporate it. And then we used open sources. So reports by human rights organizations, reports by basically news sources, and both in English and Arabic. And we were able, through grants, to hire a number of undergraduates and graduate students at UNH and at Duke to help us do this. Then to try to get at this question of what are the cumulative and interactive effects, we actually looked also at sort of sources that just talked about human security impacts over time. And so we collected documents that tried to look at things over a much broader time period. And lastly, although we weren't able to do direct field work, we were able to take advantage of the shift to virtual workshops, webinars, and Zoom to do a bunch of interviews with people who were working in Yemen, Libya, Syria, and the Palestinian territories, or who had actually rotated out and gone to places like Geneva, Amman, Tel Aviv, Ramallah. So we did do field work, but it was like at the peripheries of our conflicts, where we could talk to humanitarian and human rights organizations who had been working directly in those conflict zones. That was sort of our workaround, if you like. So just to give a little bit of a definition of what we mean when we're talking about environmental infrastructures, it is a system of providing and managing water, energy, waste, and food to make places habitable for people. And so these depend upon ecosystem services and environmental resources, as well as human investments of personnel, capital, and so on. So they're sort of at the intersection of society and nature, if you like. And although we talk about how Libya is a little bit exceptional to this, the notion that there are specific forms of making war that target these infrastructures as a systemic practice has been well documented in the work of environmental historians. And this is an environmental historian at Princeton, and Emmanuel Greike. And I thought his definition of thinking about the different forms of warfare in which we see the targeting of environmental infrastructures is important. So he said it's essentially intentionally or unintentionally, the unintentionally is extremely important, damaging, destroying, or rendering inaccessible an environmental infrastructure through violence. And that violence may be episodic and spectacular or continuous and cumulative. And what we're going to see in the conflicts that we were studying, particularly in Libya, is that the episodic form of violence, the inaccessibility of environmental infrastructures, and the both intentional and unintentional become quite important. And in the other work that we've done on this and that we've published, we look at sort of variations across our cases, and we look at different types of conflict. So acute periods of violence and war, protracted conflicts where it's episodic, and for the Palestinian territories, we look at the effects of occupation, actually different forms of occupation in different forms of the territories. And I'm happy to talk about that in question and answer. But to sort of give an overview of why environmental infrastructures are so important to Middle Eastern states, we have to think about projects of state formation and state building. And one of the central pillars of every regime that came to power at different periods of time has been to extend and integrate these things to create tighter relationships between the center and periphery. So in other words, state building was building centralized water energy infrastructures across all of our cases that actually spanned usually great distances. And this is because the sources of energy and water were often far from inhabited areas. And for our purposes, what's very important is that although this actually successfully provided things like electrification and water supply, what it also did was create vulnerabilities to conflict, particularly in urban and informal urban areas. So the power plant that services a city may be actually quite some distance. The pipeline that brings water from either an underground aquifer or a lake may be, again, hundreds of kilometers away. So it creates acute vulnerabilities to armed conflict. What we found, and it's not surprising when you look at Yemen, Syria, and the Palestinian territories, was that environmental and civilian infrastructures were often targeted as a strategy of war and conflict, and that they were sometimes used, particularly in Syria, as also a weapon of war by different parties to the conflict. But Libya actually looks a little bit different. Libya turned out to be somewhat of our exceptional case. So we kind of tried to come up with an overarching schema to think about the different ways in which infrastructure can be targeted. So the first way is the obvious one that comes to mind for all of us. That is the intent to disable or destroy infrastructure. And that's when we hear about targeting, we think about an airstrike or an artillery shell or a bulldozer, right? So direct means of inflicting damage with the intent to destroy or disable. But another way, of course, that infrastructure is damaged in conflict is through indirect effects and as effective collateral damage. So this means when a military is targeting a military, what they see as a military facility or asset, and unintentionally a civilian object is also targeted. Or it can be what's called a dual use object. So something that can be used for military purposes, but also for civilian purposes. So a power station is a very good example. So this has reverberating effects across many sectors because of these centralized integrated water energy systems. So when you take out a power plant, you also take out the water system that relies on electricity. You also take out the wastewater treatment plant. You also take out the ability to have a hospital run. So these reverberating effects, the indirect effects, are usually far more important even than direct targeting. But the last two are the ones that we found in Libya. And the first is this idea of the use and misuse of infrastructure. So this is using infrastructure in a way that it was not intended, or by simply neglecting it, that is not repairing it, not maintaining it, or actually looting and sabotaging it. And I'm going to tell you in a little bit about the different ways that took place in Libya. And then the most important and prominent feature of the targeting of environmental infrastructure in Libya was the trying to capture and control critical nodes of infrastructure across the country by different armed groups at different points in times, with the sort of intent to either capture rents from oil and gas or to be able to demand things from the center. So I'll give you some concrete examples as we go on. So whereas our work in Yemen and Syria and Palestinian territories tended to focus on these first two types of targeting, the work in Libya showed us that actually there's other ways that have equally bad effects over a longer period of time, in the sense that the neglect and misuse of infrastructure and the blockade of it can still undermine public services. So just to sort of provide sort of a back snapshot of what is an incredibly complicated conflict, I just want to highlight a few pieces of this that are important to understanding the sort of pattern of infrastructure targeting. The first one is that many of you will be familiar with. The prior regime to 2011 under Gaddafi was very weak in terms of building functional municipal and provincial governance institutions by design. So the Jamhuriya, the Republic of the Masses that Gaddafi set out to create, was supposed to rely on revolutionary committees that were fully decentralized, that were never supposed to institutionalize. And the consequence of that is that you had very little state building happening. You also, of course, had decades-long sanctions regimes imposed on the Gaddafi regime for its support of international terrorism, which also rendered it very, very difficult to build sustainable and operable systems of infrastructure. When we have the 2011 uprising, it's of course part of the Arab Spring, well, the Arab uprisings as we call them, but it's actually a revolution. And it is considered by its participants to be a revolution, a social and economic and political revolution. And it is not necessarily a foregone outcome, of course, that the opposition would have won. That was actually part of the UN and NATO intervention that actually overthrew the Gaddafi regime. And although there were elections held very early on, national and provincial elections in 2012, we don't actually get, of course, a transition to a sort of consolidated state. We end up with the collapse, the utter collapse of central state authority, except for the water energy systems. The water energy systems are going to be the thing that is seen both internally and externally as sort of holding the country together. The rest of the country, however, descends into basically the creation of proliferating militias, many of which are based in different cities, so they have quite distinctive urban identities, and they have a lot of variation in the level to which they're socially embedded in their communities. So some are genuinely seen by communities as their form of self-defense in a revolutionary moment, but others evolve very, very quickly into extortionist rackets, right, where they're basically forcing people to pay for protection. These, importantly in the Libyan case, merge into the sort of collapsing state institutions very quickly. So the state institutions that are left look a lot like Lebanon and Iraq, where essentially armed factions are controlling different ministries and different governorates within the country. And these, Stephanie Williams, who was the UN representative, notes were vertically integrated over time. So although there were 30,000 roughly armed groups in 2011, 2012 that emerged, they start to consolidate into more vertically integrated organizations that both control street fighters, but also have personnel in the state ministries. So these are not exactly just armed actors, they are now public, private, hybrid armed groups. And as many of you know from 2014 on, for a reason I'll get to in a minute, the state administration is technically bifurcated, one in the east, one in the west, one in Tripoli, one in Benghazi, between basically rival groups. And so we have the fragmentation of the state. The other really important part to think about the Libyan conflict is the regional realignment that takes place across the Middle East, North Africa, as a result of this revolutionary moment. So the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia become very important players in Libya, as they do elsewhere in the region, as part of really what is a counter-revolutionary project to safeguard their own regimes. So in Egypt after 2013, they become extremely prominent. Saudi Arabia puts down the Bahraini revolution in 2011. And in Libya, they back Khalifa Haftar, who is an emerging warlord, who creates what he calls the Libyan National Army, also known as the Libyan Arab Armed Forces. We just call them Haftar's forces because they were never an army. They are a collection of ex-army units and militias. Haftar invites in, as he starts to consolidate power in the east, the Russians, who come in 2018, 2019, And here is where the Russian presence in Syria is actually very useful, because they fly Russian planes from Syria to Libya to aid Haftar's forces. Turkey then comes in 2020 to support the internationally recognized government and essentially is interested in countering Russian interference in what it sees more as its zone of influence. And it signs 2 memorandums of understanding with the transitional government, one on military reason and one on economic zones in the Mediterranean. The current zones of control are represented on the map on the left, which is from the United Nations Coordination Office for Humanitarian Affairs from 2022, which shows essentially that Turkey and Russia have informally reached a tacit agreement that is keeping the country bifurcated into those respective zones. But it's very important to know that the cost of this has been the narrowing of the sort of revolutionary civic spaces that had been created in 2011, 2012. And in the East, Haftar and his sons are essentially reconsolidating a form of personal and familial authoritarian rule, which actually looks very similar to what El-Sisi has been doing in Egypt. And in the West, there's a bunch of rival militias who are wielding power in and out of civilian institutions. So how does all that, the background of the conflict, relate to thinking about the targeting of environmental infrastructure? So the argument that we essentially make is that rather than relying on direct destruction and collateral damage, we have a bunch of different militias, communities, and rival political authorities that seek to control, blockade, capture, sabotage, and loot critical infrastructural nodes. And this includes wellheads, electricity transmission lines, and oil export terminals. But ironically, because of what I'm going to talk about, show you just momentarily, because these are national centralized systems, it also actually induces a certain set of restraint. So many of the actors actually who are doing this will be persuaded to stop doing what they're doing by other parties when the costs become clearer to everyone. The external parties to this conflict, unlike in Syria and in Yemen, also do not launch comprehensive bombing campaigns. There's no equivalent in Libya to what Saudi Arabia launched in Yemen and what Russia launched in Syria. So this again makes Libya a little bit exceptional. However, when we look at the functioning of utilities and basic services, we find that the effect of all of this is still the decay of critical infrastructure and drastic cuts to revenues and public services. So let's just think about this national dependency for a few minutes. So many of you already know that Libya is a rentier state. It relies on the export of oil and natural gas for over 95% of its export revenues. And that means that the state, or what remains of it, the national oil company, is the largest provider of salaries to the public sector. So most Libyans have a family member who is supported by the public sector, and that actually comes from oil revenues that come from the national oil company to the central bank, to the Ministry of Finance, to a whole bunch of different publicly owned entities, many of which are now infiltrated by armed groups, right, who are using those as a source of rent. But the locus of the blockades in Libya was not nationwide. It was focused on the Sirte Basin because that is the site of most of the oil fields and installations. And very importantly, this national oil company that Gaddafi created, it was the first one, by the way, in the Middle East ever, created in 1970 when he nationalized the oil firm, is that the national oil company can declare what's called force majeure. So every time an armed group blockades an oil field or an oil depot, an oil terminal, the national oil company basically said, we declare that no one should buy these exports. And the crucial point is international firms backed up the national oil company. So the attempt to even create parallel oil companies or to basically circumvent by blockading an oil terminal or taking it over had limited utility because you couldn't export the oil and you couldn't get the revenue. So the international oil firms play a hugely important role in maintaining the integrity of Libya's national oil company, for good or for ill. The other major centralized system that we look at is the Great Man-Made River, which is essentially a system for transporting fossil water from these underground aquifers, which are part of the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, which actually runs under Egypt, Sudan, and Chad as well, and part of Niger, to the coast, which is where most Libyans live. And as a result of the conflict, Libyans have become more dependent on this water system, not less. because the attempt to build desalination plants and maintain them actually sort of fell apart during the conflict, and because many, many wells were rendered, like smaller wells were actually rendered inoperable. So in the last few years, most of the water is being supplied through either this centralized system or through another kind of well. But it's extremely vulnerable because it relies on pumping systems that rely on energy and electricity and fuel, and it was built by a consortium of international companies. Therefore, it's reliant on expertise and spare parts from outside the country. So what did we find when we looked at Libya? So we have 619 discrete incidents in our data set, and we found that energy and transportation associated with energy, like pipelines, accounted for 180 incidents, or 29% of all of that. Water infrastructure was relatively small, the targeting of water infrastructure, with only 12.6% of total incidents. And the remainder of our incidents were of small distributed elements, like ambulances, roads, markets, and healthcare. And what we think is that these were very easy to attack, right? They weren't well guarded, they're scattered throughout the country. So although they count for the majority of incidents, the attacks on water and energy actually had more far-ranging effects because they're centralized. So if we look at the distribution of attacks on infrastructure, we'll see that they follow the sort of episodic periods of acute violence in the Libyan civil war. So the first is 2011. Part of these incidents were done by NATO when it was actually part of the air campaign, but a lot of it is armed groups making demands on the central authorities to release imprisoned family members, to raise public sector wages, to get more of armed groups employed into a particular office. That was also a lot of what we see in this big uptick in 2011. The second Libyan civil war starts with Haftar's forces mobilizing the east against a bunch of rival Islamist militias in a variety of cities. That conflict period happens between 2014 and 2017. But interestingly, is when Haftar starts his campaign on Tripoli in 2019 and 2020, that we see this huge uptake in the targeting of civilian infrastructure in terms of blockades and misuse. And this is partly because Haftar is being supported militarily by Russia and the UAE to have air superiority. So actually Haftar's forces are able to blockade and capture these key infrastructural nodes because they are being given air support by external powers, as well as former Libyan Army Air Force. So when we look at the spatial mapping, we start to see that it's not the entire country that's targeted, but again, it's these particular nodes associated with export of fossil fuels or the provision of water. So essentially, although there's these 224 incidents, most of them are co-located with each other. And that tells us that the same places and facilities are being targeted over and over and over. This also shows you the size of the shape actually refers to the number of incidents. So this is actually attacks by local tribal militias that are essentially in the southern province of El Fazan. And they're essentially sort of basically independent of the authorities in the east and the west. And they're usually targeting sort of small things like a wellhead or the oil field itself through blockades. The larger triangles show us essentially that the urban centers in which oil depots were located and oil terminals were the sort of heart, if you like, of this targeting of the spatial infrastructure. When we look at who did this kind of work, we immediately see that, again, the Libyan armed forces that were under Haftar's control actually did the vast majority. And it is because at different points in time, they actually blockaded most of these oil depots for several years at a time. And also once Egypt and the UAE got involved, they were also conducting airstrikes in support of those kinds of measures. The government of national accord, unity, is doing quite a bit less, but the most important thing is that it's very hard to identify who did what in this conflict. So you can see that unidentified armed groups and unknown actors, which are almost always local protesters in the news sources, they'll just say, so-and-so is protesting this, but they don't tell you who it is. That's 28% of the total, is basically people or groups that we couldn't identify based on the original source. Militias, organized militias was 6.1. And interestingly, the Islamic State, which we'll talk about in a minute, was again small but exceptional. And the petroleum forces facilities guards are interesting because they're essentially a public employment scheme for armed groups to guard the oil installations, but then they turn around and keep blockading them and demanding higher wages, essentially, and more employment. So when we look at the oil revenues, what we can see is that the blockades on these critical structural nodes really had concrete effects. So this graph basically shows you oil exports from Libya, and we can essentially see that the blockades that basically are tracked in the data set correspond with significant drops in oil exports. And actually, there was a blockade again by Haftar's forces here, which is why you see this precipitous drop. And this precipitous drop essentially means that the ability of these bifurcated state administrations to pay public salaries collapses. When oil revenues collapse, there is no money to pay. So you have hugely volatile public budgets, and you essentially have this situation where every time an armed group blockades something, you don't know how you're going to get the money to pay public servants. Islamic State was a bit of the exception in our categorization of types of targeting, because it actually destroyed oil and gas infrastructures. And our sort of thinking about this, and of Libyan experts, is that it really doesn't have social connection and social embeddedness in the way that other urban militias did. And that actually you saw, although it took successfully the cities of Derna in 2014-15, what you saw is that in those cities, urban militias organized or came back together in loose coalitions and alliances to drive them out. So they were seen actually as sort of a foreign element. And then, of course, the US also targeted Islamic State then, and so did actually the various forces involved. So what do we see when we look at water? Water basically, as we saw, was targeted very little, but the groups that did it were essentially claiming more from the center. So there was essentially trying to get the release of family members, as I mentioned earlier, but also there's basically a sense that people in this particular southern province of Fezzan are marginalized. And so there was a lot of looting of infrastructure for things like copper, which commands a high price on the informal market. That the same reason is wellheads were dismantled, because they provided actually basically metals that could be sold. But there is a very dramatic example where water supplies in their entirety were cut off to the capital for a few months during the invasion of when Haftar tries to invade Tripoli. We basically saw that there's an instance where they take down the electrical grid, and that actually stops pumping. But even though there's relatively few attacks on water, we see that the system is decaying and actually can't supply the population. And this is because of this kind of looting, sabotage, and sort of capture and control, you can't repair it, you can't maintain it, and you can't essentially have reliable operation with uncertain electrical supplies. And you also see that there's targeting of personnel. So there's many instances in which people who are supposed to be running the Great Man-Made River or who are guarding it themselves are abducted and held for essentially a form of ransom, which again is very common in several of our other conflicts, especially Syria. So what we see is that a large proportion of the wells that supply the Great Man-Made River had fallen into disrepair. And again, Libya was a very wealthy oil rentier state that had high, basically, levels of basic service. So we're not Yemen, we're not starting from a very low level, we're starting from a very high level, and then we're seeing over 12 years, rapid decay and decline in what had been well coverage. So I'm just gonna wrap up here by just talking a little bit about the floods in northeast Libya that happened in September of this year, and to link that to kind of why does this matter in the age of intensifying climate events? Right? So many of you will have read about the catastrophic flooding that hit northeast Libya, and especially the city of Derna. But when you sort of course, look into it, there's always a story that's not just about a natural disaster, right? But about the social construction and political construction of vulnerability. And that is particularly the case when we look at Derna. So the infrastructure itself for protecting the city, which was a series of dams on the outside, on the wadis, the coastal the floodplains where the water will flow out of the mountains and down to the sea. There was a series of catchment dams. It had been well documented for 20 years that they needed to be repaired. The Gaddafi regime had started a contract with Turkish firms that was later then picked up by the transitional governments, and the Turkish firms never did their work. And the open question is, Were they driven out because Turkish personnel had been abducted in other parts of the country? Was it just corruption and either the armed forces or the Turkish contractors took the money? That's the sort of where the status of the inquiries are at the moment. But the point is that in Derna, had those dams been repaired as they should have been, they would not actually have had the catastrophic flooding that they did have. And the cost was extremely high, of 5,000 people who were killed and 42,000 internally displaced along in Derna, but also along this coastal strip that was hit by very, very hard rainfall. And to give you a sort of just sense of how fast the rainfall was, the entire annual rainfall for those cities came in one day, right? So this is what we face going forward. So to just summarize the impacts of what we see when we think about water, energy, infrastructures, and the conflict in Libya. We see less destruction that is outright and intentional than we saw in Syria, Iraq, Yemen, or Palestine. But we see other effects that are similar. One of them is that the civil society and the civil administration is increasingly crowded out by predatory armed groups. That will be of no surprise to any of us. But we also see a specific set of strategies, capture and control, that lead nevertheless to the lack of functioning. Right? So although it's not intentional and although it's all outright, we still have these effects. And what we find is that then we have a much larger role for international humanitarian and local humanitarian organizations. So again, this was not a country that had a large humanitarian presence. And yet since 2011, groups like the International Red Cross are still there working on water, working on sanitation, working on wastewater. So these effects also, I didn't have time to talk about wastewater effects and what that does for the Mediterranean, but Benghazi had one of the best systems of wastewater management and sewage treatment in the Mediterranean. It collapsed entirely as a result of many of the effects that I've discussed. And now the ICRC is trying to fund humanitarian projects to rebuild that wastewater treatment system. This is in an oil rentier state, right, which should have both the money and the capacity to do this. So we are starting to see the kind of humanitarianization of this conflict, which is not something that it actually would be expected. And as you guys know, the burden on humanitarian organizations now is unsustainable. So this is not a path forward to building infrastructure and sustaining it for human needs. So thank you for your attention, and I'm trying to leave a good amount of time for questions. Don't be shy. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for all of you giving presentation. However, I was wondering how does other sources of data collection serve as a substitute for a direct field work, and how effective were your methods that you employ in this particular project? And secondly, I wanted to ask to what extent does the infrastructural decade have an impact on the oil farms or the energy sector in Libya?
Sorry, on the what?
On the oil farms.
On the oil farms.
Yeah, or the energy sector in Libya.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
So I agree with you. I think there's no substitute for doing field work and having that kind of access. So this project was deliberately constructed as a sort of way of working around, but also trying to allow people who to tell us what they thought. So we definitely had local interlocutors, but I think that there's some fabulous work being done in Libya, both by Libyan scholars and non-scholars. So we extensively cite them and use their work. So I completely agree with you that there is actually huge amounts of work that's being done that is locally done. There's only one oil firm, so there's a national oil firm. There are no, I think one oil firm, I think it was French Total, just signed a contract to come back in for exploration, but all the major oil firms terminated their work in 2011 and did not come back because of the security situation since then. The National Oil Company, as I said from the beginning, has been able to actually maintain its position, partly because those international firms respected its state's sort of monopoly. If you like, on the scale. Yeah. I don't know that whole-
Sorry, I came a little late.
No, that's great.
I didn't get much of what you had said, but I was interested in your idea that violence has contributed to the decay of infrastructure and but I'm thinking of, my question is, in what ways has the decay in infrastructure in turn maybe increased violence, or maybe not just even a direct armed violence, but also indirect forms of violence in terms of access, with to limited resources that are there, who is allowed to use the available, clean water, who is allowed to use particular roads that are remaining or buildings or whatever, those forms of indirect violence. In what ways has this decay contributed to perhaps increase in violence in various forms?
Yeah, that's a really great question. To answer your first part, I didn't see, or we didn't see, much evidence that sort of infrastructural decay and neglect was actually increasing our conflict. That didn't seem to have that need,
Okay.
right? So most of the rivalries that you see are, again, for sort of capturing and control parts of the national oil and gas institution that can have revenue extracted from it. So local communities using the water system to negotiate with the center is not really a form of extracting rent. So they were quite distinctive. But your other question about indirect forms of violence, I think that actually the first part that you kind of weren't here for, that you're absolutely right. It absolutely facilitates restriction on access to different communities. But the point that we were also trying to make, though, was that, and this was reinforced in the interviews with Libyan armed actors. So we were able to sit in on closed workshops that were being basically facilitated by the UN or by the US as part of these kind of ongoing, there's been huge diplomatic negotiations that have been considered like ongoing that I didn't have a chance to talk about. But in those kind of forums, the emphasis wasn't really on that they felt the need to sort of take these as a form of sort of either, avoiding violence or engaging in it. What's very interesting and important about your point is that we tried it, especially in the article, to talk about the indirect effects on different parts of the population in very concrete ways. So in terms of who had water access at a particular time. And what happens is those are episodic. So water supply will be cut off, say, to Tripoli or to Benghazi for a few days to a few weeks, and then it comes back on. And so there would be a way to show that, actually. That's a really great question.
I did not know, and I don't know if I got it right, that the human beings on the Mediterranean coast, they get the utility waters. They have to get them from the deep south. Is that right?
Yes, there's
I didn't
also
know.
desalination plants.
Sorry?
There's also desalination plants.
Uh-huh. Ah, okay.
But most of them are no longer functioning, and they also, because of the sanctions regimes under Gaddafi, they actually were not built at the rate that they had been planned to be built. So the Great Man-Made River starts in like the 1970s, but it's actually only first phase of it that supplies Tripoli is only completed in 1991. So it's really only in the 1990s that you get these extensive drawdowns of fossil water. But there is a lot of fossil water there. I mean, they can draw down those aquifers for decades to come, honestly, without actually reaching, without the aquifers are going, withdrawing so quickly that you need to redo.
So there was a change in usage. In the older times, it was sort of the ocean water that had to be cleaned, and now they have another thing. All right, thank you.
So the population was growing rapidly in Libya as the custom used.
And you're left-handed and right-minded.
I don't know about the right mind, but
No, that's good.
My question is on the bar graph that you had. If you could just go back.
yeah, absolutely here to help me. Rip it off. Just like our, you loaded it.
So I may
Go
have
ahead.
missed it, but there's other period when
Mhm.
like the go up, but then it just goes down,
Mhm.
and I was wondering, like, and the yeah, what was going on there?
Yeah, let me make sure I have the right chart for you too.
Tell me, are you talking about the one over time, right?
Yeah, that.
Yeah. Oops, it's not projecting. I can see it, but, oh, there we go. Thank you. Okay, so you're talking about right here?
So
Please.
there they shoot up, and then
Yes.
afterwards, it's just like 2021 and 2022, they just disappear, and
That's
I
right.
was wondering, like,
That's because basically here we started to have a ceasefire between essentially Qatar's forces and the kind of government, internationally recognized government. And so these attacks were essentially one on basically making places inaccessible, so particularly roads, but also airports. There have been a lot of targeting of the airports, and that was literally again capturing the airport and closing it for a period of time. And that was significant because again, it stops the import of all sorts of things customers rely on. So the import of food, the import of it's essentially even Libya imports fuel, which is again kind of shocking, and also the import of basically goods, right? Supplies. So it's a very good question why all this just disappears, but and we can't be. I should just say that we are also using this as more indicative, right? I would say that, and it's kind of a response to the first question too, that the sources are fine, but they are not perfect. So there may well be instances that we just couldn't find in either Arabic or English open sources. That is entirely possible. So it's really astute of you to see that.
so it looks like the ceasefire had a negative effect.
No,
From what
but
you
these
said.
are instances of targeting infrastructure, so the higher the column, the more instances of essentially capture and control there is. So you want low, what you really want is nothing.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. What's the situation now? Do you have any intel on like what the targeting looks like? What it looked like in 2023, for instance?
Yeah, I don't, because honestly, we stopped collecting data in 2022 because we had to call a whole at some point.
So, thank you so much for the talk. I have a question about climate change, and really it's a question about how you're framing or relating the project to, say, a discourse about increasing the vulnerability that might be circulating either media or with international market. So,
this narrative of climate vulnerability on the one hand, increasing incidents of conflict. On the other, maybe having effects on the strains being put on these infrastructures. And so my sense, so both for the Libya case in particular, but then also for the project as a whole, do you see that climate change vulnerability narrative as obscuring more than it reveals potentially? What's sort of at stake in framing this as a more fine-grained kind of story about political conflict? And just generally sort of how do you relate the project to a discourse around climate and climate vulnerability?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think, like many of you probably, I have been very dismayed to see the type of discourse that has essentially said climate events like droughts lead to armed conflict. And that has been the dominant narrative, right, for much of sub-Saharan Africa and Middle East, North Africa. The other, I think, what has been happening in the Middle East is that climate change is used in a bunch of different ways by regimes. So in one paper that Erica and Neva Zawahri and I did, we talked about the securitization of the climate discourse by regimes that are using climate financing as a new source of rent, right? So portraying themselves as the victims of climate change, which of course they are empirically as well. But also then in the case, we actually looked at this for Syria too. So the Syrian regime in the run-up to the 2011 has a series of very intense droughts too, actually, prolonged droughts. But what was fascinating is the way the Syrian regime portrayed climate, and actually drought, climate change, was because it was the responsibility of the industrialized countries, especially the West. Then they basically neglected policy measures that would have reduced vulnerability in the areas that were being affected by the drought. So we get either climate change is a security issue, therefore give us more aid, or we'll send you migrants, or there'll be instability, or there'll be a revolution. or we get, we're not actually going to deal with this because it's a problem constructed outside of us. Those have been the dominant ways that climate vulnerability has been framed, at least in the Middle East and Africa. But it's also changing. I think I'm starting to think about a project with some colleagues on sort of the UAE and Egypt in COP27, 28, the Conference of the Parties negotiating on climate change. And there it's both very interesting to see the mobilization of new groups, like especially young people in civil society, but also the way that particular players like Saudi Arabia have really dominated the agenda and have actually systemically influenced the government delegations of weaker states in the region. So I was talking last week to someone who was on the Jordanian delegation and then was pulled into the COP presidency for the UAE. And he said that the Saudis just dictated the terms to countries like Jordan. Like, this is what will be said and not these things. So it's a very long-winded answer, but there's so many different aspects right now to the climate discourse that that's just some of the ways to cut it. I don't know if I answered your question.
You mentioned kind of the concept of the shared dependability, kind of leading to restraint or compromise. To what degree does that occur between like the armed groups and the government, or like to what degree, if any, do the populations living in urban centers have an impact on the episodic nature of the events?
That's a really great question. So first of all, the government is the armed groups. So that's just to remember. When we think about the public institutions now, they are
fusions of civil servants and the armed groups. But this notion that there was this recognized dependency that led to restraint was really from our interviews. That isn't something we saw in the data. That is like the way it was conveyed to us, which is that we are going to end the blockade on this oil terminal because we are being pressured to do so because of either the revenues, but in the case of public services, you are absolutely right. So urban populations who are suffering from sort of lack of infrastructure or services, they do mobilize, they do protest, and they do confront armed groups quite regularly. The challenging part of that, though, right, is that these urban communities, they are also armed, but they are not as well organized or armed. So what you have is this asymmetric power relationship, which is that in the end, those with guns are dictating some of these terms. But to the extent that some of those militias, as I was talking about earlier, consider themselves as protectors and as more socially embedded, they are responsive to this notion of not basically turning off electricity or not targeting water. And that's where that restraint mechanism happens, right? Is in this relationship between communities and armed groups. Or it just happens at the national level because public revenue is so dependent on oil revenues. So rentierism is sort of generating a certain level of national dependency, but it's also perpetuating, right, the lack of political resolution and political settlement, and also drawing in all these external interventions.
Especially during the party involved in the Middle East system, could you speak on how refugees, including Israelis, are managed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I felt when I was putting this talk together that I didn't say enough about Libya as a transit state for migrants, actually. Because when we're thinking about sources of rent for armed groups or sources of revenue, essentially engaging in smuggling of migrants from sub-Saharan Africa right to Europe is a huge source of revenue that they extort from migrants. And worse, the European Union, of course, has kind of formalized the offshoring of preventing migration by paying the Libyan Coast Guard through this. Supposedly they're training them, but really they're telling them to interdict migrant ships from setting off from Libya, Algeria, and Tunisia into the Mediterranean. So the sort of criminalization of migration from Africa to Europe is providing these armed groups with a hugely important and predatory role within the political economy of Libya. So that's kind of one dynamic. The other dynamic that you see with migrants is that in that southern area of El Fazan that I was talking about, the narrative of those tribal groups really is that they were marginalized under Gaddafi, and that they remain marginalized between these kind of eastern-west power centers. And so on that map from OSHA, they actually label them as tribes that change sides. Well, because they don't feel that they are included in either the political process or the system of generating rents from oil and gas. So one of their consistent demands has been that whoever will deliver more services and more oil revenues to the South is who we will ally with. So they are engaged in illicit smuggling of people, of drugs, and of arms from sub-Saharan Africa to the other armed groups in Libya, and then also as part of the transit trade, which really is an extortionary trade. So that didn't answer Derna, but that's the more broad question about migration. In Derna, the internally displaced populations included migrants who were either living in informal areas or in detention centers. We don't know a huge amount about what happened to them in the days and weeks after, but for the internally displaced populations of Derna and also other urban areas, there was basically humanitarian needs assessments carried out very quickly. And again, humanitarian organizations stepped in to provide food and shelter. So it's again quite stunning that one of the effects of this particular conflict has been this outsized role for humanitarian organizations, particularly in things like floods. Thank you all. These have been so interesting questions, really, really helpful to me.
You kind of touched on this earlier, but I'd be interested in hearing more about this concept of restraint, and kind of at one level, it's just maybe kind of a shared mindset of organizations that they just don't do this. But then at another level, you were kind of mentioning it's about civilian negotiations with armed groups. And so I'm wondering, in the second case there, do you have a sense of kind of maybe what is happening in those types of negotiations? But also, if we ask it as kind of a straight up political science question, like under what conditions are those negotiations successful and when do they fail?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I haven't really delved into that, so I should speak clear. I have,
I think this work, I don't know if you guys have read Claudia Gazzini, but she's a really good researcher, also work from Lasher. So they've done a lot more work on how do different armed groups interface with their local communities. And that's where that question would be better answered. So I can send you those books. But they really look at the sort of distinctive patterns of militias embedded in different urban areas. And those kinds of negotiations then really do kind of happen to be along sort of personalistic and familial and tribal lines. In other words, it's not just transactional. It's not just a sort of like what kinds of punitive leverage. It really, and it's not just what kinds of economic incentives. It really is also affective connections and sort of appealing to these groups that they are members of the community. That's at least how it would seem to come across from the examples that I read about, but I don't have like consistent explanation. The notion of restraint I outright took from Jessica Sampson's book, 2016 book, on thinking about restraint in civil war, and she looks at essentially under what conditions do armed groups restrain from targeting civilians. And interestingly, some of the arguments that she makes are very kind of obvious, but very important, which is that groups restrain themselves when they can't get away with it, either internationally or domestically. And I think when we start thinking about the targeting of infrastructure and looking at our work in Gaza and the West Bank, that's where those arguments become very clear, because if there's no international effective incentives or domestic incentives, that's when you really see that those kind of negotiations go more. Merit and Paris of the project, which I think could be a good one to do.